What if I told you that Canada holds the key to Alaska's survival, and with a single move, they could block US access entirely? Trump never saw it coming. But is it a bluff or a declaration of war? For decades, the United States and Canada have shared one of the closest diplomatic and economic partnerships in the world. A relationship built on trade, open borders, and mutual reliance. But suddenly, that foundation is shaking because of one decision, one move that could change everything. And it all started with Donald Trump. The 45th President of the United States was known for his aggressive stance on trade, his America First policies, and his belief that foreign partners, yes, even close allies like Canada, were taking advantage of the United States. His solution? Tariffs. It wasn't just about money, it was about control. About showing the world that the US dictated the rules and everyone else had to play by them. So, in a move that shocked the Canadian government, the Trump administration imposed a 25% tariff on a wide range of Canadian imports. Raw materials, steel, aluminum, even essential goods that American industries relied on. It was a direct hit to the Canadian economy, a punch that no one could ignore. And Canada? Oh, they weren't about to sit back and take it. Canadian officials immediately countered with retaliatory tariffs of their own. But this time, they weren't just throwing economic punches. They were preparing something even bolder. British Columbia, the province that serves as the critical land route between the contiguous US and Alaska, had an idea. A way to turn the tables. A way to make the United States feel the pressure like never before. They proposed a strategic toll on commercial vehicles traveling from the mainland US to Alaska. A move that, on the surface, might seem small, but in reality, it was a powerful message. It wasn't just about economics anymore. It was about leverage. And the US government? They never saw it coming. Pause to let the weight of that statement sink in. But why would Canada go this far? And how did a trade dispute turn into a political chess match that could cut Alaska off from the rest of America? To understand that, we need to go back to the moment when Trump's trade war began. Every great conflict starts with a spark, but sometimes that spark turns into an uncontrollable fire. And in this case, the flames are reaching all the way from Washington to Ottawa. Donald Trump's presidency was marked by a simple but aggressive economic stance: America first. The philosophy was clear. US industries had to come first, even if it meant breaking trade agreements, disrupting alliances, or starting disputes with longtime partners. And Canada? Well, Canada was in the crosshairs. In early 2018, Trump announced his plan: a 25% tariff on imported steel and aluminum, claiming it was necessary to protect American industries from foreign competition. On paper, this move might have made sense to his supporters: strengthen local production, boost American jobs, and make the US economy more self-reliant. But there was one massive problem. Canada wasn't just any foreign competitor. It was one of America's biggest suppliers. The US and Canada had one of the largest trading partnerships in the world, with hundreds of billions of dollars in goods flowing across the border every year. And when Trump slapped that 25% tariff on Canadian steel and aluminum, it sent a shockwave through the industries that depended on those materials. Factories across the US relied on cheap Canadian imports to keep production running. American automakers, construction companies, and manufacturers suddenly saw their costs skyrocket. The policy that was supposed to help US businesses was actually crippling them. And then came Canada's response. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau didn't hesitate. Within days, Canada announced its own retaliatory tariffs, worth $125 billion. But Trudeau wasn't just looking to match Trump's move. He wanted to hurt American industries where it hurt the most. The Canadian government targeted U.S. exports of bourbon from Kentucky, orange juice from Florida, motorcycles from Wisconsin, and dozens of other goods from key states. States that just so happened to be political battlegrounds for Trump. This wasn't just trade. This was economic warfare. And just when the world thought the fight had reached its peak, British Columbia decided to take it one step further. They looked at the map, they studied the supply chains, and they realized something critical. Alaska needs Canada more than Canada needs Alaska. It was an unspoken dependency, one that had existed for decades but had never been weaponized. Until now. Because while Trump could slap tariffs on Canadian imports, there was one thing he couldn't change: the geography. And British Columbia was about to use it as a bargaining chip in the most unexpected way imaginable. The question was, would it work? Or was Canada about to push too far? When a country like Canada, known for its diplomacy, suddenly decides to go on the offensive, you know something big is brewing. And this move, it's unlike anything they've ever done before. Trade disputes between the US and Canada aren't new. They've had disagreements over dairy, lumber, even auto parts. But never before had Canada considered something as bold, as unprecedented, as strategically devastating as this. British Columbia's lawmakers had been watching the battle unfold. The tariffs, the retaliations, the mounting economic pressure. And then, someone saw an opportunity. Alaska. For most Americans, Alaska feels like a distant, untouchable part of the country. But in reality, it's entirely dependent on Canada. The roads, the trade routes, the airspace, all of it goes through Canadian territory. And British Columbia? Well, they just happen to control the only direct land route connecting Alaska to the rest of the United States. That was when the plan was set in motion. The province proposed new tolls on U.S. commercial vehicles traveling through British Columbia to reach Alaska. On the surface, it seemed like just another political response to Trump's tariffs. But in reality, it was a warning shot. This wasn't about the money. The number of affected trucks was relatively small. But the message it sent was loud and clear. You tax us, we tax you. You close doors on us, we close roads on you. British Columbia's Premier, David Eby, made his stance clear. We will not tolerate these ongoing threats and uncertainty. We are standing up for Canadians. This behavior is unacceptable, and we are making it clear to the U.S. just how frustrated we are. The move was calculated. By imposing tolls, Canada wasn't just playing defense. They were taking control of a vital American lifeline. Imagine it. A simple road connecting Alaska to the U.S. suddenly held hostage in a geopolitical chess match. It was no longer just a trade war. It was an issue of territory, access, and sovereignty. And the White House? They didn't take it well. As news broke about Canada's decision, U.S. officials scrambled for a response. This was no longer just an issue of tariffs. This was a direct challenge to America's ability to reach its own land. Suddenly, Alaska was at the center of a diplomatic crisis, and Washington knew that if they didn't act fast, they'd be at Canada's mercy. But the real question was, what would Trump do next? That answer was coming, and it wasn't what anyone expected. For years, Alaska has relied on Canada's cooperation. But what happens when that trust is shattered? And more importantly, what happens next? As soon as British Columbia announced their plan, panic spread through U.S. industries and government offices. The White House called it an unnecessary escalation. Trump's allies downplayed the situation, insisting that Canada was bluffing, that they wouldn't actually go through with such a drastic measure. But businesses? They weren't so sure. Truck drivers who depended on uninterrupted routes through British Columbia suddenly feared delays, new costs, or even outright travel bans. Alaska's trade partners started to look for alternatives, but here's the problem. There were none. There is no direct land route from Alaska to the mainland US without going through Canada. The Alaska Highway, originally built during World War II, is the only viable road connection. And while air travel and shipping were still possible, they were significantly more expensive than trucking goods through Canada. For Alaskan businesses, it was a nightmare. For the US government, it was a diplomatic disaster. Meanwhile, Canada wasn't backing down. The pressure on the US began to build. News outlets started reporting on the economic risks, highlighting the dependency the US had on Canada. The narrative started shifting. Is America really in control of its own trade? For Trump, who built his presidency on strength, dominance, and control, this was an embarrassment. But the situation was about to get worse, because Canada's provinces weren't done fighting back. After British Columbia's bold move, other provinces followed suit, each of them hitting the US in a different way. Nova Scotia doubled tolls for US trucks crossing its highways. Manitoba banned American liquor imports, removing US-made alcohol from store shelves. Alberta blocked American companies from bidding on local government contracts. This was no longer just a trade war. It was becoming an economic rebellion. And Trump? He was running out of options. The White House had two choices: negotiate with Canada and de-escalate the trade war, which would be seen as a weakness. Retaliate even harder, risking further damage to US businesses and angering states that were already suffering from the tariffs. The pressure was mounting. The clock was ticking, and the world was watching to see. Would Trump double down and escalate the fight? Or was Canada about to force the United States to back off? The answer would change US-Canada relations forever. This isn't the first time the US and Canada have clashed over trade, but history tells us one thing: every time the US pushes too far, Canada finds a way to strike back. The battle between the US and Canada over tariffs and trade restrictions didn't start with Donald Trump. In fact, this fight has been going on for decades. Some might say it's as old as the relationship itself. To understand why Canada is pushing back so aggressively, we need to look at the historical playbook. Because every time the United States has tried to tip the scales in its favor, Canada has fought back, and sometimes won. Let's start with one of the longest-running battles in North American trade history, the Softwood Lumber War. For over 40 years, the US and Canada have been locked in an ongoing conflict over softwood lumber. The US has repeatedly accused Canada of subsidizing its lumber industry, making it cheaper than American lumber. Each time, the US has slapped heavy tariffs on Canadian wood. And each time, Canada has retaliated. The result? Decades of lawsuits, counter tariffs on US goods, a trade war that never really ended. But that was just the beginning. Let's rewind to 1971. President Richard Nixon, in the middle of an economic crisis, imposed a 10% surcharge on all imports, including Canadian goods. Canada responded with its own tariffs, making it clear that it wouldn't be pushed around. Within months, the surcharge was lifted. Then came 2002. President George W. Bush levied 30% tariffs on foreign steel, hitting Canada hard. But Canada was exempted thanks to its ties through NAFTA. The steel tariffs were eventually scrapped after international backlash. And then there was 2018, Trump's infamous steel and aluminum tariffs. Canada's response: a calculated counterattack. They targeted key American exports, specifically those coming from politically sensitive states. Bourbon from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell's home state. Orange juice from Florida. a swing state. Motorcycles from Wisconsin, home to Harley-Davidson, a company Trump publicly supported. This wasn't just about trade, it was about playing the political game. And now, with the British Columbia tolls and other provincial bans, Canada is following the same playbook, but with even more strategic precision. The message is clear. We're not just retaliating. We're making sure the right people feel the pain. And the US? It's starting to feel the pressure. Because as history shows, Canada doesn't back down. And this time, the stakes are higher than ever. If this was just a political disagreement, it would be one thing. But now, this battle is moving into international law, and it could set a dangerous precedent. When a country imposes tariffs or trade restrictions, it's not just an economic decision, it's a legal move with global consequences. And right now, experts are questioning whether Trump's tariffs and Canada's response are even legal under international trade agreements. Let's break it down. First, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, the modernized version of NAFTA. Under USMCA, free trade between the three nations is protected. Tariffs are supposed to be minimal unless there's a justifiable reason, like national security. And this is where Trump's move becomes legally shaky. The White House justified the 25% tariffs on Canadian imports by citing national security concerns. They argued that foreign steel and aluminum could weaken U.S. infrastructure and defense capabilities. But here's the problem. Canada isn't a hostile country. In fact, it has been a military ally of the U.S. for decades. Canadian metals are already used in U.S. weapons, buildings, and vehicles. There was no real security threat, only an economic justification, which means the tariffs might violate the USMCA. And that's not all. Canada has another legal weapon, the World Trade Organization, the WTO. The WTO has strict rules about trade barriers, and many experts argue that Trump's tariffs violate the principle of most favored nation (MFN) treatment. In simple terms, under WTO rules, the U.S. can't unfairly single out one country for trade restrictions without a legitimate reason. Canada can file a formal complaint and force a legal showdown. And if that happens, the U.S. might be forced to back down. But Canada's countermeasures also raise legal questions. Can British Columbia impose tolls specifically targeting U.S. trucks? Can Manitoba ban American liquor? Can Alberta block U.S. businesses from government contracts? The legal experts are divided. Some say Canada is on solid ground. Their counter-tariffs are a direct response to Trump's move, and they have the right to protect their economy. Others warn that Canada is pushing the limits of trade law, and if the U.S. decides to escalate, this could turn into a long legal battle. And then there's the nuclear option, because if Canada wins a WTO case against the U.S. and Trump refuses to comply, Canada could retaliate in an even bigger way by suspending U.S. trade benefits under USMCA, by cutting off key exports that American industries depend on, or, in a worst-case scenario, by shutting down the Alaska trade routes completely. Because legally speaking, British Columbia controls those roads. They could stop U.S. trucks anytime they wanted. The question is, would they actually do it? Or is this just another strategic move in a game that's getting dangerously close to spiraling out of control? What started as a simple tariff dispute is now a full-blown economic war. And the most surprising part, it's not just Canada fighting back, it's multiple provinces, each with their own weapons. At first, it seemed like British Columbia's Alaska tolls were just a warning, a strategic move to remind Washington that Canada had leverage. But when the United States refused to back down, something unexpected happened. Other provinces joined the fight, and suddenly, this wasn't just a trade dispute between two governments. It was an all-out economic rebellion. Let's break it down. Nova Scotia's retaliation. Nova Scotia, a province that depends heavily on trade, decided to double tolls for U.S. trucks traveling on its highways. It was a clear message. If American businesses want to move their goods through our province, they're going to pay for it. Small? Maybe. But across thousands of shipments, it meant millions in added costs for U.S. companies. Manitoba's liquor ban then came Manitoba. This province banned American liquor imports from state-run stores, removing U.S.-made alcohol from all government-controlled retailers. It was a symbolic move, sure, but for American distilleries, this was a direct hit. Canadian liquor sales generate hundreds of millions of dollars for U.S. alcohol brands, and overnight, those brands lost a major market. Alberta's business blackout. Then Alberta took things a step further. Premier Danielle Smith announced a ban on U.S. businesses from bidding on Alberta's provincial government contracts. For American construction companies, technology firms, and suppliers who had long depended on Alberta's business, the door just slammed shut. And the timing? Brutal, because Alberta was preparing to launch billions of dollars in new energy and infrastructure projects. American companies would have profited, but not anymore. The message from Canada's provinces was louder than ever. If the U.S. wants to play economic hardball, we can too. But here's where things got really interesting. As Canada escalated its countermeasures, some American businesses started panicking. U.S. farmers who exported grain to Canada suddenly faced rising tariffs. Small businesses that relied on cross-border trade saw shipping costs skyrocket. Major American retailers with stores in Canada began rethinking their supply chains, and behind the scenes, American governors started calling Washington. Because the truth was becoming clear, Canada's response was working. The pressure was mounting on the White House, and Donald Trump, he was running out of options. His administration had two choices: double down and escalate further, possibly risking an all-out trade war; back down and negotiate, a move Trump had always avoided because it would be seen as weakness. The stage was set for the final showdown. And the question wasn't just about tariffs anymore. It was about who would blink first. Every war has a final turning point. And this one, it could change U.S.-Canada relations forever. So, what's the end game? As tensions reached their peak, the world was watching. Trump's team scrambled to manage the fallout. Canadian officials stood their ground. And Alaska? Well, Alaska was starting to panic. Because while Washington played political chess, real people were feeling the consequences. Truckers faced delays at the British Columbia tolls. Alaskan businesses struggled to get supplies at affordable prices. Cross-border tourism took a hit as U.S. and Canadian travelers hesitated in uncertainty. But despite the economic strain, neither side wanted to be the first to cave. Then something unexpected happened. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce stepped in. This wasn't just a government fight anymore. Corporate America was getting involved. Major U.S. businesses, ones that depended on Canada, started lobbying Washington to stop the trade war. Why? Because they were losing money. American auto manufacturers needed Canadian steel. Construction companies needed Canadian lumber. Retailers needed Canadian imports to stock their shelves. And they weren't just asking nicely. They were threatening legal action, pressuring senators, and putting real weight behind the push to end the standoff. Suddenly, Trump had a new problem. If he continued the trade war, he wouldn't just be fighting Canada. He'd be fighting his own country's biggest industries. And just when it seemed like the crisis couldn't get more chaotic, Canada dropped one final bombshell. British Columbia announced that it was prepared to fully close U.S. access to Alaska. Not just tolls, not just fees. A complete shutdown of commercial traffic between the lower 48 states and Alaska. This wasn't a threat anymore. This was real leverage. And for the first time, Washington blinked. After weeks of economic battle, Trump's administration sent backdoor signals to Ottawa. They were ready to talk. No press releases, no public apologies, just quiet discussions on how to end the standoff before it spiraled out of control. And behind closed doors, both sides worked out a deal. The details? Well, neither country ever fully revealed what was said. But here's what we do know. The 25% tariffs were quietly scaled back within months. Canada lifted its retaliatory tolls and trade barriers. Alaska's supply routes remained open. And Trump? Well, let's just say he never publicly admitted that Canada had won this battle. Because in the end, this wasn't just a trade war. It was a power struggle, a test to see how far Canada was willing to push back. And in the end, they played their cards perfectly. Now the question is, could something like this happen again? Because if history tells us anything, it's that the next trade war might already be brewing. What do you think? Did Canada make the right move, or did they push too far? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into global power plays, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Because trust me, this won't be the last time nations go head-to-head over trade.